Welcome to Talk Across America. I'm Doug Miles, and we're here in beautiful Sarasota, Florida. And joining us now in our Book Talk segment, great to welcome. Woman has written a very fascinating book about the history of our food and the safety of food. A very interesting story, goes back quite a while, and it's called The Poison Squad, One Chemist's Single-Minded Crusade for Food Safety at the Turn of the 20th Century. We're joined today by Deborah Blum, and she is a director of the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT, also a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She joined us by telephone today. And Deborah, good to talk with you. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have a chance to talk with you, a chance to read through the book. And, I've heard a little bit about this kind of story, but I didn't know the details of it. This is really fascinating. I always wondered, we have, all the regulations now on food, which is good, but at one time that wasn't the case. And boy, I'm surprised we survived as a species back in not that long ago with the food situation. Pretty scary.
Yeah, one of the shocking things for me when I started doing the research was realizing that I had this fairy tale idea about food of the 19th century. That Americans were happy, pink-cheeked consumers of nothing but the best. And sadly, it's almost the opposite, because in the 19th century, which is before any consumer protection regulation by the federal government, there's kind of this permissive era in which businesses feel very free to, grow their profits by making the food production less expensive to them. And so there's this insane amount of food fakery, food additives, a crazy use of new industrial preservatives, and no requirement to label or inform. And so I'm happy to talk about what I found, most revolting in all this if you want, but it's a long list of bad food.
And it really doesn't go back that far. My parents grew up, they were Depression kids, and even back then, refrigeration wasn't that great. I remember the old ice boxes, they had that for a while when they were kids. So food, safety then, wasn't great. That was like the 30s. So it's not that long ago that we've had to deal with this.
That's exactly right. You were so smart to say that. And in fact, at the end of the 1930s in 1938, which is past the period of my book, but they actually updated consumer protections and created the modern FDA because there were still so many problems. Not as bad as in the 19th, where you could just literally do anything to food. So you could put brick dust in cinnamon or grind gypsum, which we use in wallboard, in flour, or charred rope in pepper, or dyed sawdust in coffee, or formaldehyde in milk to preserve it, which references your point. There's not very good refrigeration. Milk spoils. We don't have pasteurization, so it's teeming with bacteria, altered by dairymen who would thin it with water. There's this one lovely case from Indiana in which the dairyman had decided to use pond water, so there's actually horsehair worms swimming around in the milk. But mostly, thank goodness, I don't know how good it was, but it was still just plain water. Then they dye it with chalk, and then or color it with chalk or plaster, and then they'd preserve it with things like formaldehyde because it rotted. People didn't have refrigeration. There were a lot of bacteria teeming away, and of course, then the preservative itself turned out to be poisonous. So doctors in the mid-19th century used to nickname milk poison because they thought it was so dangerous. And there, I think, regulation is really, and pasteurization, of course, have really brought us forward to a better place.
Yeah. Well, again, the main, let's say, character of the book, but the person you write about is a man called Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley. I guess he's the godfather of food protection in a way, right? First of all, how did you get involved with the project, and how did you do the research on it?
So, Harvey Wiley was a chemist at the Department of Agriculture at a time that there was no FDA. And he took up, and we're very lucky, in the 1880s, he took up the cause of food safety. And he actually had the chemists in his very tiny department, there were only 6 chemists when he started, start to investigate food safety and food fraud in the United States. And he spent 20 years, a lot of the stories I was telling you are from his work, just showing how bad food was. And so he was part of this consciousness-raising movement where people started realizing just how many awful things were in their food. And he eventually, in 1902, this is the title of my book, got so frustrated with the lack of, federal response to this that he said, okay, I'm going to demonstrate to you that these are bad. And he couldn't do this now, but he persuaded young government employees to volunteer to dine dangerously, right? They had a kitchen and a dining room and a basement of the Department of Agriculture, and in exchange for 3 free meals a day, these young government employees agreed to add capsules with formaldehyde or salicylic acid or copper sulfate into their meals every meal so he could test out whether these were harmful to people. And today people wouldn't volunteer for that. Back then they had no idea. And Harvey Wiley didn't have any idea just how bad it was. He later said, when he was talking about this experiment, that it persuaded him that food in the U.S. had become extremely dangerous and that he was going to have to, cast off the mantle of being an objective scientist and just crusade, which he did. And that scandal of the Poison Squad and the following exposures of, terrible meat, you see this in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906, eventually forced the government to say, yes, when we're talking about protecting Americans, we're actually talking about protecting them in their everyday lives. And we are, for the first time in American history, going to set up some consumer protections. And that's what regulations are. They're consumer protections.
Teddy Roosevelt was the first to sign that into law, right? When he was president?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
He was. He was very engaged in looking at managing and regulating business, and one of the things he did was sign both the Meat Inspection Act, the first act in the United States that said the government would indeed inspect meat, and the first law that said the government would set safety standards for food and drugs, the 1906 Food and Drug Act. Both passed within about a week of each other. So there was this huge public roar of outrage, followed by Roosevelt saying, and he really did, he said to Congress, do this or else. And they actually fell in line.
I always wondered, though, like you said, back in the 1800s, 1900s, or, when they had meat, I guess, if you killed a cow and you cooked it right away, it was okay, but you couldn't store it. And obviously that was a problem with meat, right?
Yes, that's right. And so some of these preservatives like borax, went into canned meat. And so, again, we're using in a way that we don't have to quite as much, although we still use preservatives. There was a very heavy use of chemical preservatives because of the lack of refrigeration. And the other thing is, sure, if you're on the farm and you're there with your own chickens and livestock and killing them right at the time, you're going to have really fresh meat. For a lot of Americans in this same industrial period, they're moving to the cities, they're working in factories, meat has to be processed elsewhere and shipped. So a lot of the meat scandals actually at that time focused around the stockyards of Chicago, where they slaughtered thousands and thousands of cows and sheep and pigs and then processed them. And then because these factory conditions were really bad, the meat would rot. They would scrape off the mold and dose it in borax and pack it up and ship it out. And some of that's in the jungle, but some of that's also was found when government inspectors, after the jungle went out, came back and said, oh, it's even worse than in the jungle, right? And so just those details drove this sort of national wave of revulsion that this was not acceptable. And if the business wasn't going to hold itself to account, then someone representing the American consumer had to hold it to account. And that really was the beginning of consumer protection in the United States. It's actually a landmark year for saying, yes, our job is to do some consumer protection, and we are much safer on this side of it than we were before.
Yeah, fascinating story. Again, it's called The Poison Squad, one chemist's single-minded crusade for food safety at the turn of the 20th century. And I guess we all have to thank Dr. Wiley every time we sit down to eat a hamburger, right?
That's right.
And a glass
I
of milk.
thank you, Harvey, every day. Thank you.
Deborah, do you have a website you can direct people to, get more information about the book?
Yes, I have an author website, which is DeborahBlum.com. And the book is also, you can find it on Penguin or at Amazon or, any other place where you're looking for a book that I hope you will find fascinating.
Great. We'll also put a link on our website. But Deborah, pleasure talking to you, and we'll hopefully talk to you again. Thanks for being with us.
I'd like that. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us today on Talk Across America. Please visit our website at dougmilesmedia.com for more great interviews and content. And if you're interested in any of the books we talk about on the program, please click the Amazon link on our website. It helps support the podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again real soon here from beautiful Sarasota, Florida.
I'm Stan Brock. 30 years ago, I formed Remote Area Medical to help people overseas. But then we found generations of families in America isolated by poverty from the health care they need. Together, we can take dental, vision, and medical help to 1 million adults and their kids, right here at home in the United States of America.